players. Now, I can only imagine that this snobbery was much more pronounced further back in history. Number two, you were probably never taught the thing that made you want to play the saxophone in the first place. When you chose to take up the saxophone, you were probably inspired by something you heard. Now, how many people had ever heard classical saxophone or even knew it existed when they decided to take up the saxophone? The vast majority of saxophone students want to learn jazz or rock or pop or smooth jazz or blues or some form of popular music. Yet when they start taking lessons, they are all given the same tired old method books and lessons that we give to oboe and bassoon players. No offense, double reed people. This is the equivalent of a student wanting to learn how to play the drums because they heard Led Zeppelin, but then restricting them to learning orchestral percussion. Anywhere in the world, if you want to learn the guitar or the bass or the drums in some popular music style, you can go pretty much anywhere and get lessons on how to do exactly that. Not so for the saxophone. And this brings me to reason number three. Saxophone teachers often teach the same way that they were taught. Now, this is not a criticism of my saxophone teaching colleagues for whom I have a lot of respect. It's just exactly what I did when I got out of college. I started teaching lessons and I taught the exact same things that I learned because that's what I knew. Now, for a student who wanted to get first chair in their audition to be in the symphonic band or ace the Glazunov concerto at some competition, this is arguably the right way to teach. The reality is that nobody really wants to do those things. We do them because those are the performance opportunities available to us while we're within this education system. Take two teenagers. Bobby gets guitar lessons at the local music store. The first couple weeks, he learns how to strum a few chords, and he's already able to play along with some songs that we hear on the radio. Sally gets saxophone lessons. The first week's lesson, she learns how to put the instrument together, and maybe if she's very advanced, she learns how to play B, A, and G whole notes. The second week, she goes back, and maybe she learns how to play half notes and some rests. By the third week, she's begging her parents for a guitar, but her parents already paid for the saxophone up until the end of the year, so she has to stick around and continue to learn hot cross buns. By the end of 3 months, in December, if she can play the chorus to Jingle Bells, she's considered an advanced student. Meanwhile, Bobby is already in a band with his friends who are taking bass and drum lessons. Sax teachers, we don't have to keep teaching this way. Sax students, you don't have to keep learning this way. Number 4, not all saxophone teachers are saxophone players. My first saxophone teacher was a clarinetist. Now, when you go to music teacher school, the first thing they do is they show you how to learn and to play all of the different instruments at a very basic level. So if you're a trumpet player and you learn to become a music teacher, you're going to have to learn how to teach all the saxophonists and flute players and clarinet players, even though that has nothing to do with your main instrument. So if you learned saxophone at a public school in America, chances are your first teacher was not a saxophone player. This basically guarantees that students are taught the standard classical method that is as boring to teach as it is to learn. Now, I know there are a lot of teachers out there that want to and try to teach something different. The problem is it's just not that simple, which brings me to problem number 5. Your teacher may not be allowed to depart from the curriculum. I know that when I was at school, I had a sax teacher who wanted to start a jazz band for us. The music director, however, wouldn't allow it. This is another example of the classical music world looking down its nose with condescension and perhaps a bit of jealousy at saxophone players and jazz musicians. Later on, when I was at university taking weekly one-on-one lessons studying classical saxophone, my saxophone teacher, who was also an accomplished jazz musician, would only allow us one jazz lesson per semester. Now, I'm sure this was not his choice, but rather an obligation to his employer. There were dozens of saxophone students at my university, and all but a few individuals were passionate about learning jazz, but because jazz wasn't offered as a major, we were all required to study classical saxophone. This just serves to perpetuate the worn-out classical learning method for the next generation, which would become our students. This cycle continues today. 20 years later, I recently filled in for a classical saxophone teacher at a local music conservatory and was told by the director of the school not to teach anything other than classical saxophone to my students, even if they asked me for it. Not cool. If you went to music school like I did, sometime around the 4th semester of music theory, you may have asked yourself, why do I need to know what a Neapolitan 6 chord is, and why do I need to know how to compose using a 12-tone matrix? Spoiler alert, you don't need to know how to do either of those things. It might explain why sales of 12-tone music party hits didn't do so well. Which brings us to number 6. Schools have to fill a curriculum with enough stuff to justify the tuition, the budget, the salaries, etc. This means that learning music, which should be a very individual and personalized pursuit filled with practicing and listening and playing with other musicians, becomes a classroom activity. Everyone learns the same lessons, the same repertoire, at the same pace, basically, regardless of each individual's level or needs or area of interest. I'd like to learn how to play like Louis Armstrong, one student says. Sorry, Louis Armstrong is not in the curriculum. This week, we're learning how to play giant steps, and next week, it's going to be odd meters. And don't forget, the following week, your free jazz composition is due. Most university music students are only getting the degree because they need it to qualify for some well-paid teaching job down the road. Or in my case, because society says you need to go to university, and I chose to major in music. By the way, I've met a number of outstanding musicians who did not major in music at all. And I can remember asking myself, how did they get so good while majoring in law or math or philosophy? If an individual just wanted to learn how to play music, they could save themselves the enormous expense of going to music school. For example, Berklee costs like over $50,000 a year. If you had $50,000 to spend, you could take private lessons at $100 an hour from some of the top musicians and teachers in the world, and you get 500 private lessons from them, which is more material than anyone actually has to teach. Mastering an instrument is about putting in the work. It's not about who you took lessons from or where you went to school. The student has to put in the work themselves, and that work is never completed. It's a lifelong pursuit. Any professional will tell you that the real school is the bandstand and the practice room, and that the most important teachers are on the recordings and within ourselves. What if students just sought out the masters that they wanted to learn from and studied with them while diligently practicing on their own, at their own pace, and in their own chosen direction? That sounds like something people did a long time ago before our modern education system rewrote the rules. Now, I'm not saying don't go to music school. If you've got the money and 5 or 6 years to kill, knock yourself out. I had a great time at music school. And I can tell you how many symphonies Mozart wrote. I can tell you how to compose with a 12-tone matrix. I can't remember what a Neapolitan 6 chord is, though. What it comes down to, though, is none of this is necessary if you just want to play music. There are countless examples of great musicians who never learned in an institution how to make music. Okay, my rant is over. Now, after a lot of thought and experimenting with students, I've come up with a different system for how to teach saxophone. Now, the system works for beginners, and it works for anyone who's only ever studied in that classical institutionalized way of learning music. It includes some of what I learned at school, of course, but it's mostly the things I would go back in time and tell my younger self if I could. It's the very valuable tricks I picked up along the way that no one ever taught me in music school. It's the simple explanations for musical concepts that, for me, have replaced the very complex ones I learned at school and in books. It's the flexibility to learn at your own pace, since everyone is different. And it's based on the concept that all music shares common threads. And if you learn these basic building blocks, you will be free to